Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the EBI seminar series on science communication. I'm here today with Darren Incorvaia. Darren is a freelance science journalist and a comedian. His work has been published in various news outlets such as the Scientific American, Science News, and New York Times. His work covers various topics such as insects, paleontology, botany, and much more. How are you doing today, Darren?
I'm doing great. How are you, Logan?
I'm great. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to jump in with our first question, which is, could you give us an overview of your career and what has brought you to science journalism?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me here. Yeah, so I've always loved animals ever since I was a kid, and from a very early age, I knew that I wanted to be a biologist. So I went to Michigan State University for college. I studied zoology and microbiology. I stayed at Michigan State for graduate school, got a PhD in ecology, evolution, and behavior, studying bumblebee behavior, was doing everything I could to become a biologist. But while I was there in graduate school, I started realizing that my favorite part of what I was doing wasn't necessarily the research itself, but it was sharing the science, sharing my research with other people, like through teaching or outreach events, because bees are great for outreach events. And I've always really enjoyed reading and writing as well. And these two things kind of inspired me to start my own blog so that I could share cool things about, biology and animals with the world, just, on my own terms. I'm sure nobody really read the blog, but it was helpful in that, it was a way for me to keep writing, and it was a good signal to the outside world that I was interested in science communication and writing, which ultimately paid off when a friend of mine from my graduate program, who finished a few years before I did, got me started with fact checking at Discover magazine, because she was working there at the time. And that led to me writing stories for them, for their website as well. And through that process, I found that I really enjoyed talking to scientists about their research, and then, explaining that research to non-scientists. And that made me think maybe science journalism would be a good path for me. And then things escalated from there, I guess you could say. And I started writing for other outlets, and now here I am doing it full time.
Amazing. So, on a more specific note, what are your favorite topics to write about?
Yeah, so animals, of course, are probably my favorite thing to write about. I love all animals, but I especially like writing about invertebrates, things like insects, the creepy crawly things, because they usually don't get a lot of love. And I like shining a light on them to show people how beautiful and interesting and important they are. In addition to animals and invertebrates, I also really like writing about how science is or sometimes isn't used by, politicians and policymakers, right? So science policy. I wrote a story, for example, about a proposed policy to set speed limits for boats off the east coast of the United States to protect endangered whales. I like those kinds of stories, conservation angles, policy angles. And I also really like writing about kind of the practice and culture and institutions around science, the people doing the science itself. Um, so an example there would be a profile I wrote of two researchers who are approaching the study of animal behavior, one of my favorite topics, from a feminist lens. So a new way of thinking about animal behavior. Um, I like those kinds of stories too. How are people actually approaching the science that they do? Yeah, those are some of my favorite topics. I try to keep an open mind about story ideas.
Yeah, that all sounds super interesting. So, what would you say are the biggest challenges in being a science journalist?
Some of the biggest kind of day-to-day challenges would be, well, first is managing tight deadlines. So one of the big types of stories that a science journalist writes usually are kind of these shorter stories, maybe 500, 800 words about new research results, right? And you might learn about these new results that are going to be published in just a few days. And so you'll only have a few days to write your story before that new paper, that new result, hits the world. And your story needs to be ready when that paper comes out. So you have to quickly, you know, learn about the study, read the study first, and find people to interview to talk to about the study, and then write a draft, go through edits with your editor, it's just all very quick sometimes, and that can be a challenge. Um, and I just mentioned interviewing, which is a whole separate challenge in and of itself sometimes, because you might just think it'd be easy to talk to a scientist about their work, right? You just ask them like, explain your study, explain what you did. But when you're in the middle of a really tough interview and you're not getting anything good, you're not learning anything, you're not getting good quotes, and you realize, oh, this is actually interviewing is a skill that you have to practice. You have to learn how to get good information out of people, because not everybody is trained in how to talk to the media, for example. So that can be stressful as well and difficult. And sometimes it's just tough to find story ideas in the first place. You mentioned I'm a freelancer, and so that means I'm finding my own stories a lot of the time, and sometimes it just seems like there's no ideas in your head or nothing is clicking with you that you're finding. So that can be difficult as well.
So, as a freelance journalist, can you explain a little bit about what this entails and what are its benefits?
Yeah, so being freelance basically means being self-employed. So what I do is try to find, those story ideas as I was talking about, and I pitch them to editors at different outlets, like some of the ones you mentioned, Science News, Scientific American, etc. I try to pitch them to editors who might be interested in them, so that they'll commission me to write a story about it. So it's kind of like, being a gig worker, I guess, which people are familiar with. These days it's a story by story basis. You're working for these people and being paid. Um, and so this can be really good because you have flexibility in the types of stories you're writing. Like, you're coming up with the story ideas, you're finding these research results you want to write about, and you're pitching them to editors. Or even if an editor that you're working with a lot approaches you and says, hey, can you write a story about this? You can say no if you don't want to write about it. Whereas if you're a staff writer somewhere, you likely have an editor who can assign you a story, and you have to write the story, whether you actually, care about the topic or not. So that freedom and flexibility, choosing your topics, choosing the hours you work, right? You can write whenever you want, um, is a huge benefit of being a freelance journalist.
Would you say it's a common path for science journalism?
I say it is pretty common, although being doing pure freelance science journalism for your career, for your livelihood, is not something I would usually recommend to people, just because it can be very difficult to generate a sustainable income from it, because you're not a salaried employee. You're not getting a regular amount of money every 2 weeks or every month, whatever it is. And so it can be tough to get by on just doing science journalism. So what I think I would usually see people doing is combining freelance journalism with other types of science communication work. Maybe you're sometimes writing press releases for a university about new results coming out of that university's researchers, that kind of thing. Or you might have a completely separate job entirely. For a lot of the freelance work that I've been doing, I wrote while I was also working full time in a different field entirely. I was a grant writer at a natural history museum, which is, it's tangentially related, but it's not science journalism, right? So usually, writing only science journalism to get by is really tough. Things are expensive, rent is high, and it's not something I would say is achievable for a lot of people. But if you're combining it with other types of, income, it's doable, yeah, and that's kind of more common.
Okay, thank you for your transparency. So, what do you think can be done to improve the quality and accessibility of science journalism?
Yeah, improving the quality and accessibility of science journalism. The first thing I would say is to know your audience, right? So even all these different outlets that exist that are publishing science journalism are targeting kind of different readerships, right? Some of them are meant more for like the broadest possible general public. Others might be specifically targeting people who know more about science, but aren't scientists themselves. Some outlets are targeting scientists or trying to communicate science to other scientists, right? And so depending on who you're writing for, that'll affect the language you use, how it sometimes affects how like creative you can be with the story, right? Are you able to include little like jokes and things like that in the story? Some outlets are more serious than others. And so you have to know your audience, right? Because if you're writing for an outlet that targets like the general public and you're using a lot of jargon and things like that, your editor's going to come back to you with a lot of track changes in the document, and that might affect your ability to write for them again. So you have to know your audience. The second thing is to know your craft, like know about writing itself. And so this usually means, to me, it means reading a lot of other science journalism, but I also think it's important to read more broadly than just science journalism. So creative nonfiction, fiction itself, memoirs, and so on, because you're learning about writing itself by reading all this other types of writing. So as an example, I'm currently reading Mrs. Dalloway, a novel by Virginia Woolf. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And it's like it's a stream of consciousness novel, right? And so Virginia Woolf is using these really creative like sentence structures to make you, the reader, feel like you're inside the head of these characters, right? And it's like it's a really good book, and it does something that a lot of other books could never do, right? And so I I could never write something that's like Mrs. Dalloway, right? But there's things I can learn from Virginia Woolf's writing in that book that I could maybe apply to my own storytelling in my own like journalistic work to try to pull readers in a certain way, depending on the topic. So I think it's really important to read a lot and read broadly in order to make your own writing more accessible and just give you more tools and techniques to use.
So, on the other side of things, what do you think laymen can do to understand the world of science better?
The first thing I'll say, of course, is to read science journalism, and not just my own science journalism, but lots of science journalism, and go out of your way to read different kinds of sources. Like I mentioned, different outlets are targeting different audiences, right? So check out what all those different outlets are reporting on, right? I have a group of kind of publications that I check every day just to see, you're not going to read every article, but just see what the headlines are. And that'll give you a big sense of kind of what's going on broadly in the world of science. I also think it's important if you want to understand the current world of science, right? Whether you're a non-scientist or a non-science person or a science journalist, it's important to keep in mind that science is not this like concrete body of knowledge that's waiting to be discovered, right? It's not a fixed thing. It's an activity that people do. It's the process of generating knowledge. And because it's a human activity, there's always going to be these human influences on it and on the knowledge it generates, right? Um, so for a layperson, this might mean like you want to be accepting of what science tells you, especially based on the evidence and the opinions of many experts, right? But you want to keep an open mind that things can change as we learn more or as we go back and question previous work, right? So for example, I mentioned this profile I wrote of these two researchers who are kind of rethinking the study of animal behavior from a more feminist lens. And one of the things that one of those researchers found in her graduate work was that this idea that a certain type of lizard called anoles, they're very common in, all over the place in Florida, the Southwest, you can see them scampering around. But there was this long held belief that these male anole lizards were territorial. And this researcher found out that that belief was actually based on a poorly done laboratory study from like 100 years ago, where essentially these researchers were keeping male lizards in cages and saw that the males were attempting to copulate with each other, essentially, in these cages, right? And they assumed, because there's this homophobic bias, they assumed like there's no way these lizards would be doing this in nature. There must be something that prevents them from doing this in nature. They must be territorial, right? And like that idea got fixed in the literature until 100 years later, somebody looks at it much more critically and realizes, oh, these lizards actually aren't territorial at all, right? And so it's keeping an open mind about those kinds of things, that the perceptions you're bringing to your work or that scientists are bringing to their work can influence the kind of conclusions they draw. And whether you're reading about science or whether you're a science journalist yourself, you have to keep those things in mind, right? And the other thing I'd say about this as like, I guess, a tip for science journalists along this vein is to remember that you're not doing PR for science or scientists. It's not your job to make science like look cool, to make this new result seem really important, right? If it is really important, you can say that it's really important, right? But that's not your job to like hype up these new research results, right? I think of science journalism as like a subset of broader journalism where if you're a journalist who writes about the government, right, say the United States government, it's your job to hold the United States government accountable, right? That's like part of what you're doing is you're talking about here's what they're doing, here's what's going on. Maybe even beneath this veneer of what the government wants you to think they're doing, right? You're uncovering these truths. And I think science journalism, you're also trying to hold science and scientists and these scientific institutions accountable, right? So you're not trying to make scientists look good or anything like that. You're trying to accurately tell the truth about the science. What does it say? What does it mean? Do all scientists agree on this? Those kinds of things.
Perfect. Thank you. That was so interesting. So, our last question for today is in the vein of giving advice to science journalists. What would you say as advice to students who are interested in potentially pursuing science journalism?
Yeah, my first piece of advice would be to write a lot. I already mentioned reading a lot is being important, but you also have to be writing a lot. You don't even have to be writing about science necessarily. I mean, of course, some of it should be about science. But even if you're keeping like a daily diary, if you're writing a diary every night, or if you're writing short stories, fiction, movie reviews on like Letterbox, it doesn't like, I think any type of writing you're doing helps you improve your voice and your writing ability, right? You just need to be putting words down a lot. And in terms of science, like writing about science specifically, um, look for opportunities to write about science wherever you can. I mentioned I kind of got started in this whole career path by writing a blog just for myself. And I honestly, it feels weird now, but I can trace where I am right now directly back to starting that blog all those years ago, even if I would never read one of those blog posts now because I'd be too embarrassed, right? Um, that was hugely important because I was writing regularly about science, right? There are often student publications that you can write for. I know Berkeley has the Berkeley Science Review, I believe, that, you can write about science there, and that's great. Those are clips, those are examples of your work that you can use to show other people for other opportunities. Um, there are professional societies that you can join. There's the National Association of Science Writers. They're great. They have an annual conference that I think is just ending now. That's a great time to meet other science writers and learn about science writing and science journalism. And there's a publication that specifically publishes journalism about science writing, if that makes sense. So it's kind of meta in a way, but it's called the Open Notebook. They have tons of great articles about, how to pitch stories to editors, how to go through edits, how to craft a story, all these kinds of things. They have an early career fellowship program. I'm an early career fellow this year. So they're a great resource as well. And two other quick things I would say that you could do is first is if you're on social media, and I know some parts of social media are in a weird place right now, right? Like Twitter/X, might not be as good a community as it once was. But there's tons of science writers and science journalists on there. So you can connect with people there, follow them, find them, read their work, just see what other people are doing in science journalism. And there are also graduate programs for science writing. Three that I can think of are NYU has one, MIT, UC Santa Cruz. Those are some of the big programs. And I didn't do any of those programs, so I'm not here to like shill for any one of them, right? But those can be hugely important for building connections and getting internships and things like that. So if you're looking to do more schooling in that regard, you can look at those kinds of programs as well. But I think all of that, is predicated on you need to be writing all the time, and have examples of your writing to show people, even if it's just a blog, have examples to show people when the time comes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. That just about does it for all of our questions, but thank you so much for all your transparency and all of your insight. Myself and everyone at the EBI, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you the best of luck on any of your future projects.
Thanks so much, Logan. I really appreciate it.
Of course, have a great day.
You too.
Thank you for checking out the EBI seminar series on science communication. If you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on how science is communicated. Be sure to follow along for future installments or check out our previous series and explore our social media, which are all linked in the description below. Thank you for watching and see you next time.